So my name is Marie Gardam, and I was born Marie Geraldine Lamb. I recently discovered that I was named by my parents. I was born in Malaysia, and what I now know is for sure is that, my parents, my mother who's Indian and my father who's Chinese, were working together in a Catholic school in Taiping, which is, North Malaysia. And they were in love. And my father has talked about it and written about it. His family was, fine with it. Her family seemed fine with it while they were in relationship until my mum got pregnant. And then it was kind of, suddenly there was consultations happening with the priest at the school. And the priest seems to have organized my mum to have been sent away to Kuala Lumpur. So that was about 7 hours from where they were, to a mother and baby home, a Catholic mother and baby home. And my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, went to the house and begged them, not to do this and to support. And she was thrown out. So from my paternal side, they wanted me. They wanted, they welcomed me into the world, but they didn't have any control at all. So for, I think, a couple of months, my dad was just worrying about where my mum was. He didn't really know anything. So he just sat in the priest's office one afternoon and just cried until the priest took sympathy on him and arranged for him to visit my mother. And after that, the nuns allowed him to come once a month. So he had some access, but obviously it was very controlled. From his perspective, although it might seem naive, given what we know about mother and baby homes now at this point, I think from his point, they wanted to be married. They wanted to be parents. When I was born, he was called and he traveled the 7 hours to come and greet me into the world. So he was one of the first people to hold me, and they named me together. And he was given he went away and did the documentation on my birth certificate. So his name and her name are both on my birth certificate, which I do have. And that's sorry, I'll just try and mute those notifications. It's really rare for intercountry adoptees to have their birth certificates. And in particular, Malaysia seems to, as a matter of course, fake birth certificates when it comes to adoptees. They can put down the adoptive parents' names and just make it seem as if that's as if born to kind of thing. So it's still a mystery to me how I do have my birth certificate, but I do, which allowed me to eventually find them. So he was there on the day I was born, and then he went away and did the paperwork. He arranged to sort of meet her again in a week, be back in a week or 2 weeks. I think it was 2 weeks. And then a week later, he got a call from somebody saying he had to sign adoption papers. And he refused. He was completely shocked by it all. He refused, but he was pulled up in front of a judge and told he had no choice, that my mother had already signed adoption papers, and therefore he didn't have any control over the situation, because once the mother had signed, that's all they needed. Except that doesn't make a lot of sense, because they needed him to sign something, right? So I can't make sense of it, but a judge told him, he was told he had no choice. And we've since kind of looked at documentation, which seems to still be the case, that a father can't even adopt their own daughter. They could adopt their own son, but not a daughter. And that still seems to be in the writing around it as well. So he was just kind of thrown out of the mix, and he went to the mother and baby home where I was about 2 months later. So around the time, just shortly before I was adopted, where I went home with an adopted family, and tried to get access to me and my mother. And they told him that I was gone, that I'd already been taken somewhere else. And I had actually heard that from my adopted parents in the last few years. So within the last few years, after my 40s, I turned 50 this year, my parents casually told me, my adopted parents casually told me, oh, your dad came back for you. And I was so shocked by that I kind of laughed about it. And I went on this little journey around it, kind of going, oh, my father came back for me. He wanted me. But then I've internalized, lots of Western society and white supremacy, I guess. And also I've heard a lot of stories on new adoption, kind of, I'm a part of now a huge community of adoptees. And I know that we are commodities as babies and we are profitable. And so I went on a journey of thinking, well, maybe he just wanted to sell me, or, maybe I have no way of knowing what he wanted when he came back for me. And I also didn't know how to revisit that conversation with my parents. I just didn't know how to pick up on it. I was too shocked at the time to ask questions. And I've never been able to really revisit it. But then it was pretty much verified by my dad as well. So the story is completely synchronous, that they lied to him, the nuns lied to him and sent him away. My parents did the same thing, quite casually. There was no sort of shame in it. They may have been feeling it, but it wasn't reflected in what they told me. And so I discovered him on Facebook last year. So in 2021, in April, I was kind of having a last ditch attempt. I was investigating the cost of using an investigator. But I've been seriously worried about doing that because we're so exploitable. They can kind of go, oh, we just need another 1,000, or we just need another 1,000. And, you have no idea whether anyone is actually helping or supporting you. So I searched for his name again on Facebook at about 5 a.m. It was on my mind in the middle of the morning. I'm sure many adoptees have that. And I think it sort of benefited me that it was that sort of half asleep time, because I pushed past something that I now realize I hadn't been able to before. So I've been searching for them, always, certainly practically since my 20s, but existentially, always. But that for an inter-country adoptee, there's just no route. That there was no route in my 20s, which was sort of in the 90s. The routes that I would be sent on would be for domestic adoptees, and I'm just not even listed there, so there's nothing for me. So as Google and Facebook began to emerge, I would occasionally once in a while look and not find anything. I also didn't have the context of their names, how common were their names? Everyone would say Lam is a really common name. So I kind of had no belief that I could actually find them, even though I had the birth certificate that named them and also had their ID number. So in some ways I had something really concrete. In other ways, I didn't really know how to use this key, to find the lock for this key. And at different periods, it now turns out that I found him several points in that journey, I think. So I found a picture of him. It's like a school picture of the staff at that school. So, maybe it's a lot of people, but there's a tiny picture of him in the back of that picture, just by searching for his name. I'd probably come across his name on Facebook before as well, but it's slightly different. And I think I kind of remember going, oh, it's probably not him, and just not pushing past to sort of, there's a real difficulty for us adoptees trying to work out, what do we say to these people, even like thinking about writing to the school. What do I say to a school to ask about this man, knowing that they may not know anything about me? This is not even family. This is his workplace, potentially. They may know nothing about me. And even if they did, they may not, my experience with the nuns who I'd written to at 20 was them telling me, we're really sorry, we can't help you. We have to protect the natural and the adoptive parents. So that tells you who this was about, right? It was nothing to do with me. It was all to do with, allegedly, they weren't even really protecting the adoptive parents, my natural parents, my biological parents, because we know that they'd turned away my dad, and I suspect they'd coerced my mother into signing adoption papers as well. So it was a complete fabrication that they were protecting anyone but my adoptive parents or themselves. So I knew that it was a culture that, put adopted person on the birth certificate in red ink, and pretty much the bureaucracy is kind of not encouraged or discouraged from supporting any search. So what do we say? Even finding my father, I was thinking, what do I say to him? I don't know what I say to this man who may or may not be a relative of mine. Where do you begin this conversation? Saying, did you have a daughter? But for some reason, I reached a point, having been in community with adoptees for a few years and being leading communities for a few years, I reached a point, and having therapy, I reached a point where I was able to push past that and become more practical. And so I just asked him, I just wrote a text saying, I'm looking for his name, who knew my mother's name in 1972. If that's you, can you let me know? And he accepted my, within 20 minutes, he had accepted my kind of request and replied kind of going, what? Yes. Who are you? And, I still have a video of our first conversation, which I'm still trying to work out what to do with it, because I feel like it's worth sharing with the world, but I don't quite know how to do that at this point. But it was this beautiful conversation of him. It was so clear, so quickly. He'd been waiting for me. He had no means of finding me, but he had lived a life. His life had just been thrown out by, he just kind of sleepwalked through his life and been waiting to find his lost daughter. He'd been estranged from my mother since that point. She'd been exiled to Singapore. He'd had 3 other children. So I had 3 paternal siblings, which I knew about at that point. And I had by that point also found, a couple of years ago, I found an obituary from my mother, but I didn't know if it was her. I found an obituary in her name that also mentioned that she had a daughter. And it didn't have any leads. Well, it actually did have a phone number on it, but I had assumed that phone number was the newspaper's phone number, Only when someone mentioned it recently did I realize it was actually a relative's phone number, but it no longer works. It may have worked at the time when I found it. I don't know. So I didn't know. It had a photo of her. It had, the date of her death and that she was survived by a husband and a daughter. And I had no way of verifying if it was my mother. But when I found my father, I sent it to him and asked him, and he said yes. So then I knew that my mother had died in 2016 before I had found her, and that I did have a sister. So I, at that point, didn't know, am I the daughter? That's unlikely, but could it be me that they mentioned? Given the way I was given away, I didn't think they would name me in there. But so I never knew, was that me or did I have another sister out there? And yeah, it turned out I did. She was more difficult to find. Her naming is not kind of consistent with our family names because my mother married, I guess. My mother had remarried eventually. It took her 17 years to get on with her life, to find someone she loved and be able to, be happy again in some way. And my father helped me to find my sister, and I found her in October, about a year ago, October last year, which is also the month in which my mother died, all those years ago. And my sister knew nothing about me, so I told my sister on Instagram. That's how she discovered that I existed, from me and on Instagram from this stranger. And she, luckily my sister, she didn't really doubt me from the beginning. She was completely shocked, but she said, I looked at your face and I saw her there. So I do. I wouldn't say I look exactly like my mother, but you can see me in her and vice versa. There's some angles are there where it's definitely, she's my mother, definitely, and my sister could see that straight away. So yeah, it took her a few days to kind of verify the story with family members and just get her head together to just the degree that she could talk to me. But then we've been talking ever since, and she welcomed me into her life from then. So she's in Malaysia. They're all in Malaysia. I have a sister on both sides and 2 brothers on my paternal side as well. But both of my sisters I've connected with in a deeper way and been able to talk to fairly regularly just by WhatsApp. So I've talked to my paternal sister by video just once, but nobody else. That seems like a really big step, bigger than actually meeting in person, because it's so intense having these video conversations. You can only look at each other. You can't, when you're in person, you can look off into the distance, have some quiet time, reflect. on a video call as a first introduction to your own biological family, it's just too intense for me to think about. I think other adoptees who've not been lucky enough to find that quite distressing or hard to imagine, but reunion is just so intense. And I don't think you can fully appreciate how you sometimes want to slow it down when it happens. I think I would have probably gone to Malaysia the minute I found my dad, if I could have, but it was during the pandemic. And so as somebody who wasn't legally related to them, I actually wasn't able to travel to Malaysia to find them in the way that other relatives would have been able to go at that time, even though it was locked down. Relatives, people who were citizens or relatives, of which I was neither legally, were able to travel there. I wasn't. And that has been lifted this year. So in the last few months, you can now travel there. But, since then you've unpacked a few things and it just gets bigger. It just gets more complicated. And other things are going on in my life, like moving house twice this year. So other things are happening and I have been slowing it down. And I'm now in a certain kind of place of knowing I already lost my mother before I met her. My dad is now 71. So there's a part of me kind of going, I have to get there quickly. And other people reiterate that. And a part of me kind of going, I'm not ready. I'm not ready for it. So that's where we are. And I think for me, one of the pieces that I do want people to appreciate is the fact that I had been looking for him and had found him, but hadn't been able to cross the line at many points during this journey, because I think that illustrates how complicated it is for us as adoptees, that search, and that we do it alone. We really do it alone. There's no system for it. There's no support from family members. To a degree, even people who want to support you don't really know how to, and they're kind of thinking of it from a very different perspective than you are as an adoptee, how big it is, how complex it is. I think my husband wanted to support me, but he decided support looked like just letting me lead the way, which is not a right or wrong decision. But from my perspective, I think I did need someone to sort of step in and help me with it in a much more proactive way, because I was stuck. There was no way to undo Pandora's box once you did it. And I think that's what we all know. We don't know what we're going to discover. Was I a child of rape? Was I unwanted? There's no way to undo it. And I just couldn't find the strength to cross the line for a long time until I was, 48. I was adopted. I'm Chinese Indian, born in Malaysia, and I was adopted by a white couple who was stationed there as RAF. My dad was in the RAF. So they left there when I was 7 months old and came back to the UK. So I was then in a completely white community, almost 100% white community. And so it was never doable for them to lie about me being adopted or hide it in any way. And so the one thing I think they did well, or one particular thing I think they did well, was to have told me since I was a baby, since I was old enough to sort of begin to understand. So I have no memory of being told I was adopted. So it was very kind of, to that degree, there was no taboo around it. They would always answer my questions to some degree. I mean, I would ask questions and they would kind of answer them. I still feel like there was a sort of taboo, like there was a discomfort, like there was a looking back over it with a little bit more life experience. Like, I think what I noticed is they never asked me any questions. They never allowed the conversations to grow into something richer or grounded in the emotions of it or the humanity of who were these people that I came from. They never expressed any interest in who they were. And my questions were met with answers, of which there were limited answers. So the conversation ended quite quickly and they would just change the subject. So there's a mix of it being open, but not really open, not richly discussed in a meaningful way that allowed me to explore what it meant to be adopted and to explore that my mother and father and possible siblings, uncles, aunts, it turns out I have, maybe dozens of aunts and uncles. They were human beings, and nobody at any point during birthdays, expressed anything about my mother or my father, or they must be thinking of you, or I wonder what they're doing now, in the way that those secret conversations are going on in my head. Who are they? And at the same time, I'm a Chinese Indian person who looks ambiguous because I'm mixed race, right? So I don't look Chinese. I don't even look Indian until I think. So most people tend to guess South American. I'm in this world where my race isn't talked about, really. It's not shamed. There's occasional microaggressions, but it's not something my parents were equipped, to do any anti-racism type conversations about, or even recognize that their experience of life was completely different to mine, that there might be things going on in the school ground that they're just not aware of, or even just me being present in a room, standing out in every room. What's that experience like? Going to a family reunion in an adopted family where everyone is white. Everyone. It never occurred to anyone to kind of go, not only are you adopted and not related to these people, but you're from a whole other culture. So that must be, that must be strange for you. That must be, how does that feel? Nobody kind of named it. And so I didn't really have language for it either, because there was no language created or taught to me. I always felt, so I knew very deeply the story of my parents' infertility and the sort of journey of trying to have children, and the fact that my adopted mother had been, called barren and incomplete for not having a child in the 70s and in the 60s. So I kind of internalized, I think, their pain around that, and projected that they probably didn't really want me to have my own family, that would be competition or hurtful in some way, even though nobody ever expressed that really explicitly to me. And I'm still not sure to what extent that is the case. My dad had died by the time I found my biological father. We'd been estranged during that time because of a kind of coming awake after Brexit, during which they voted for Brexit, and we started having all of these conversations around race and racism and essentially beneath the lines about adoption. But they didn't really know at that point that's what these conversations were about. I did, but it took me a while to start confronting that, and the sort of front-facing conversations were about George Floyd, about Charlottesville, about Brexit, about immigration, about the fact that I am an Asian immigrant. And my mum kind of blinked at me and said, "Oh, we never thought of you that way." And I started to realize from that point that I'd been invisibilized around my culture. And even my friends were kind of, when I started sort of, from that place, I started identifying as Asian when in conversation with people. And even my friends would kind of go, "Oh, but you're British," and I think there's so much complexity to the fact that that wasn't meant in a harmful way. It was probably even meant as a, "You're one of us" kind of way. But it's also a little bit racist to sort of invisibilize my culture and assume that it's better to be British than it is to be Chindian or Malaysian. There's all these layers to it that you have to unpack, and it took me so long to unpack it, and I'm still unpacking it. And I'm still looking back at how I just kind of assimilated and took on the sort of white culture. In some ways, I enjoyed being different. I enjoyed being unique. And in other ways, I recognized that it made me an outsider even more so in many ways. I was already living, because we were moving around a lot as an Air Force family. I was constantly an outsider in so many ways. But then I was also an outsider in my family, an outsider in my culture, and we were moving. So I didn't have roots. I didn't have even adoptive roots beyond my parents. So people didn't really talk about, even though it was kind of very visible that I was adopted. I wouldn't say growing up, my friends talked about it freely. I came across one other adoptee who I casually kind of ran into the fact that she was adopted because she was Indian, and she clammed up straight away. So we didn't talk about it. I recognized her discomfort with it straight away and just left it. And that's the kind of, that's demonstrative, I think, of the kind of culture we have around adoption, that there is shame. And so even another adoptee didn't really want to talk about it as a sort of 12-year-old. so I wouldn't say I never felt ashamed of being adopted. I even felt maybe in some ways special, unique, interesting in some way. But yeah, that's just a flip side of also just trying to make sense of being an outsider, trying to make sense of trying to kind of integrate what that means for me. But I was desperately lonely. I didn't have connections, particularly as a teenager. I struggled to form really strong friendships with people. And because I was moving and they were moving around me, on those occasions when I did, I would lose them quite quickly. And yeah, so if I think about the media and kind of growing up, where was I represented, both as a Chinese Indian person, as an adoptee? I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this lately. If there's any representation at all, and it's limited, it's of Black people mostly. It's not of Chinese or Indian people. In the era in which I grew up in particular, it's beginning to change slowly, but still, we're queuing up for representation. So, and I'm not at the front of the queue, and that I understand why that is. But yeah, Goodness Gracious Me was a kind of UK show that represented Indian people, and it makes me cringe the way it's so I don't know, it's not what I would view as representation of who I am in any way. And it felt like they were a laughing stock. It felt like they were being laughed at for being Indian, rather than, even though it was an Indian cast, they were doing it to themselves in some way. They were kind of playing along with the joke. But and maybe if you're Indian, you recognized your family in that way. But obviously I was raised in a white family, so I didn't recognize it was a stranger to me, this kind of culture. Chineseness, I didn't really see at all in the media. And as an adoptee, it would be the Ugly Duckling story. I completely resonated with the Ugly Duckling story of kind of imagining, oh, well, I'm a swan. I love that sort of outcome of, oh, I don't fit in here, but I fit in somewhere, or I belong somewhere, and somewhere I'm beautiful, in that sense. Yeah, there's all these Orphan Annie stories, and Disney is just terrible at putting these stories of, it's either about, even Pinocchio recently, which has recently been done with Tom Hanks, who I love watching Tom Hanks, but I can't watch it because that story to me is so triggering, because it's about adoptive parents, right? It's about parents or people who have struggled to have children of their own, and it's that pain that is at the center of it, right? The puppet, the Pinocchio character, is literally a puppet, literally a sort of proxy for a human being, and not an actual human being. It's not about where he came from or what feelings he has. It's about him resolving something for adoptive parents, and that's often what I see in stories in the media. Even recently, looking at Grey's Anatomy, the way that's written by an adoptive parent, and to me, it really shows. So you have a lot of adult adoptee characters in it, but the way they're written is very superficially and very and Grace and Frankie, the sort of moral is often, oh, but you're my real mum, talking to the adopted parents, or there's just no interrogation of what it means to be in reunion with people that you've never met, or cultures that you've never been a part of. There's no real interrogation of that at all. Birth families are usually kind of talked about as damaged people or inferior people in some way, whether it's because they're people of color or because they are from poverty or from drug addiction is often thrown out, and abuse is often thrown out. And it's weird because there's a dichotomous thread there of people recognizing that trauma is the link and disadvantage is the link to how family separation occurs. But there's also a bias that accepts that we're better off in some way than being with our biological families. And that's so much the thread of how the media deals with it. And plus Hollywood is just flooded with surrogate parents, adoptive parents, and so the story is very much of saviors and of this is doing good in the world versus doing harm in the world. There's no Hollywood adoptive parent that I've seen who is trying to raise their adoptive child's voice, trying to, support what it means to be an adoptee and trying to get out of the way of the story in any way. I haven't seen that happening. I barely see it happening in sort of non-celebrity community, but it does happen a little bit. But yeah, it's definitely not happening in the most profound marketing campaign of adoption ever, which is Hollywood, really. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm an atheist, so that makes, to some degree, it makes it easier for me to sort of just have an outsider-in view of the church. To be honest, I was always a little bit worried, knowing that I'd been born in a mother and baby home, and that my parents were clearly Catholic in some way, which didn't, clearly colonized in some way, because even my name, Marie Geraldine, which I was named by a Chinese and Indian person, and my name is a colonizer name, It was complicated for me just thinking about reunion, because I'm an atheist, I'm a feminist. I just imagined what will I have in common with these people who have clearly been so bought into it that they would give up their own child. That's what I'm thinking from a pre-kind of reunion place, and a place of fear. In finding my father, I've discovered that he worked for the church for a long time, even after losing me, as a counselor within the church, among other things. He's done plenty of different things in his lifetime, but that was a big part of his life. But he has kind of arrived at the same place as me from a different path, which is just seeing the corruption and the sort of lack of compassion behind it all. It's just a system. It's an organized crime syndicate. We've had those conversations by text. We pretty much agree on that it's an evil kind of system. And in terms of the place that I was born, somebody recently asked me what I would like to tell them, and I just think, how dare you think you know better and place judgment on my family for who's better for me. And I imagine these nuns were a lot of different mixed races. They were in Malaysia, so there may have been white people there, but I think from the pictures, there were lots of different Asian nuns there, but all colonized, by the same principles. I was apparently named after one of them because they were kind to my mother. That's complicated for me too. Okay, they were kind, but it also turns out that they lied to my father. So what was real kindness and what was just manipulation, or, also just being kind, but also doing something evil, it's possible for them to have done both of those things. And I have such complicated feelings about how could I've considered writing an open letter to them to sort of try to make them aware. They're in a whole other country in which Asia just has a whole different relationship with power and hierarchy already still. So I wouldn't say they're behind us, but they're much more entrenched in the idea that human rights are, an extreme idea about the West, So I'm living in this dichotomy of coming from the West, where I'm extreme here in terms of expecting my human rights to be given to me as an adoptee, as a person of color, as a woman. There I'm like, just going over the top. So I have a complicated relationship, wanting to have some kind of dialogue with them, wanting to probably just have a voice in what happened to the people who did this to my family, feeling completely bemused, perplexed by the fact that the church completely avoids any accountability around this, and very little conversation about it either. I had some Catholics come to my door here in South London recently trying to proselytize religion, and they picked the wrong person, because I am somebody who will try to respect religion when it's somebody expressing it, a friend or even a stranger just expressing it in normal everyday life. But if they come to my door and try to convert me, then for me, all bets are off. And so I had a conversation with them about the fact that the Catholic Church stole my mother and stole me from my mother. And, you can see this whole dissonance while being sympathetic human beings. Again, there's this conflict of these people who I think like to think of themselves as kind and compassionate people, but full of white savior kind of messaging around. But we do all this work in Africa, and and come and speak to our priests. I'm like, I'm not coming to speak to your priest. Why would I do that? Why would I put myself through that? You go advocate for me. You're the ones here on my doorstep. But yeah, I don't feel that they really wanted to engage at all. They got the shock of their lives that they were going to get a reality check around how I viewed the Catholic Church. And it's not like there's any evidence they went to their priest and said, oh, there's obviously something we should, address here. And there's a person we can act as a human being. We can actually, because I said to them, you should be paying for my family to come and visit me. You know how much it costs to be an inter-country adoptee, to try and reunite with your family. I can go there. I'm lucky enough to be able to afford to go there, but they will never see my life. They will never be able to know what it is to be British and actually live a life here. They're, again, because they're not legally related to me, visas, I think, are game over. As family member, that's not going to happen. They might, if they had the money, which they don't, they could maybe come here for 2 weeks, but could they spend 6 months or a year here and actually be a part of my life in a meaningful way, the way that family gets to know each other? Normally in a much more natural way, but even in this way, they couldn't do that, both from an expense perspective and from a visa perspective. And the Catholic Church does nothing to rectify that. It has nothing, and they've got so much money, which they've taken from all of us, and there's so much money, and there's absolutely no appetite to rectify or put this right, or any meaningful apology. There's an unwritten contract that you have with your family, even if it's not actually stated, that you don't care about your roots, that you don't pay an interest in them, that you don't reach out for them. And it's a contract sometimes it's explicitly stated by people, but even when it's not, it's so written into the story of adoption that we know it, even if we're not told it, that we're not supposed to search, that we're supposed to have loyalty to our adoptive family. Even if we feel outsiders, and we're clearly outsiders in that family, we're supposed to be loyal as if we're subjects in some way and objects in another. Yeah, it's unwritten, but it's very clear to us as adoptees that there are rules that we're not supposed to break, which involve searching for who we are. And at the same time, there's this obsession with adoptee reunion stories, right? Both in fiction and definitely in the sort of find your roots type stories and documentaries. Everybody cries along with those stories or feels emotions, but I think in the same way that we can't articulate it, they can't articulate why they feel those things, because a part of them thinks that you were just a baby and you didn't feel anything. You don't feel anything as babies, right? Because you can't remember, so therefore you didn't feel. So there's definitely all these conflicts in what people believe, but none of them support adoptees to find agency in their own life, in their own identity.